My name is David Caroli, and I'm going to be the moderator of this Melbourne Climate Futures panel discussion. I am an emeritus professor here at the University of Melbourne in Melbourne Climate Futures, as well as being a member of the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Thanks, Kate. I sometimes live in the past. I'd like to welcome all of the in-person participants in the audience here, as well as welcoming everyone involved in this as the, if you like, online video audience. We will have plenty of time for questions from the online audience. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar platform. And we will also have time for questions from the in-person group. Now, moderating the questions will be an interesting aspect, but we have a very capable assistant in the back of the room. Beth will be helping me with moderating the questions. But please, if you have any questions, you can also, how would I say, support or tick questions, which allows people, if you think there's a really interesting and important question, you can support that online. We don't particularly want the in-person participants to get involved online as well. You each only have one person, I think, unless you actually want to do the other, if you like, alter egos for yourself as well, so you can support and offset the other ones. The topic today is, are nature-based carbon offsets based on good science? But before I get to, if you like, my introductory remarks, what I would like to do, first of all, is to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, but also the traditional custodians of all the many different countries across Australia, and recognise their elders, past, present and emerging, and also to recognise their sustainable management of country across Australia for thousands of generations, because we can learn from the traditional custodians about how to try to manage 4 degrees of global warming or more in 100 years, because they have managed 4 degrees of global warming from the last ice age to the current interglacial period. They are the only continuous Indigenous communities and civilization that have survived in Australia and globally, from the last ice age to the current interglacial period. I'm going to start by sort of giving a very brief introduction to both climate change and carbon offsets. There are really important 2 milestones that have taken place this year. The first one is the completion of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report, which was completed in 2023 with its synthesis report. And one of the key conclusions from the IPCC assessment, not from just this one, but from the previous one as well, is that every tonne of carbon dioxide emissions from human activities adds to global warming, which also has the opposite, which is that every tonne that isn't emitted from human activities potentially reduces the final level of global warming. And the second thing that's taken place this year is that in response to the federal election, the Australian government has passed new legislation with stronger emission reduction targets for 2030 than the previous government. And those are both really important. And in addition, the Australian government has introduced new requirements for the safeguard mechanism, which requires that the largest industrial greenhouse gas emitters must reduce their emissions intensity by about 5% a year in the future, starting from the 1st of July this year. And in order to achieve these facilities and industrial emitters may choose to try to offset some of their emissions by purchasing ACCUs, or Australian Carbon Credit Units. But what's critically important is how effective is this system of ACCUs and offsetting emissions, and that will depend on the quality of the carbon offsets. And at present, the largest magnitude of potential offsets in Australia is only through nature-based carbon offsets. And therefore, this panel discussion and the panel speakers will examine the science behind these nature-based carbon offsets, the benefits of them potentially, and the pitfalls and limitations, and any important considerations in implementing these, particularly in the context of fair, equitable, and responsible land use across Australia. I'm going to start with some numbers because my original background was as a mathematician. So numbers are the answer to at least some things. Australia already has nature-based, human-caused negative emissions reported to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But the numbers are relatively small. They sound large. 40 million tonnes of negative emissions from nature-based land use change and forestry were reported in 2020 as part of Australia's emissions. Now, that might sound large, but it's actually a tiny fraction of Australia's human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. That's 500 million tonnes, more than 10 times larger. And that Australian emissions are a tiny fraction of the global annual emissions of 40 billion tonnes, or 1,000 times larger than the negative emissions from Australia. And unfortunately, they're an even minuscule emission content or magnitude relative to the global annual natural sources and sinks of carbon dioxide, which are more than 500 billion tonnes. So think of that. How long is it going to take for Australia to ramp up its 40 million tonnes to have a substantial input to 500 billion tonnes? And the answer is it's impossible. But those natural emissions are offset by natural uptakes in existing natural systems. So I'm going to hand over now to our three panel members, and I'm going to start off by introducing all three of them. Malte Meinshausen, sitting here on my left, on your right on many of the screens, is a professor in climate science. He also in the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Malte was one of the lead authors of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, in both Working Group 1 on the physical climate science and also in Working Group 3 on mitigation, and also a core writing member of the synthesis report that came out earlier this year. His main research activities are on carbon budgets, on climate scenarios, and on reduced complexity Earth system model, the MAGIC model, which doesn't involve magic, just involves a simplified representation of the Earth system and climate system. He joined the University of Melbourne in 2011 from PIC, Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Impacts. And next to Malte is Kate Dooley. She's going to be the second speaker. Kate is a research fellow in human geography. And you're going to see that actually most of our panel members, including myself, are part of the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Kate is currently an ARC DECRA Research Fellow, which she started in 2023. She has policy expertise in forest governance, climate change and carbon accounting, and more than 2 decades of experience in advising government and non-government organisations. And her current research is on the potential for ambitious restoration of natural ecosystems to remove and lock up atmospheric carbon. We'll hear more about that a little bit later. And finally, our third presenter is online, is Rowan Foley. Rowan is the Chief Executive of the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, and I've known Rowan for a number of years. Rowan comes from the Bachelor people who are traditional owners of Kagari, or Gari, which is Fraser Island and Hervey Bay in Queensland. Rowan was also the founding, or is the founding CEO of this Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, and he'll talk more about that a little bit later. He moved to the Northern Territory in 1989, working as a ranger on the Uluru-Kachijuta National Park, and then returned to Uluru-Kachijuta National Park as the park manager in 2005. Rowan was also the first land management officer for the Kimberley Land Council in 1995, and he established the Land and Sea Management Unit in the Kimberley Land Council and negotiated the first Indigenous protected area in Western Australia. He is obviously a key person who can help us to understand Indigenous perspectives on nature-based land and carbon management. I've used up too much of my time, but it's over to you now, Malte. Take hold of the clicker and turn your microphone on.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you all for the discussion. And I just have 2 or 3 slides just to bombard you with the conclusions, just to first address the main question: are nature-based carbon offsets based on good science? Well, there's a lot of good science in terms of the measurement, in terms of the biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, there is good science involved in most of these activities. Even if they weren't based on good science, are many of the nature-based solutions worth doing? Absolutely, for biodiversity benefits, for better sustainable land management. Many of these are really good activities. Now, key question: is it based on good science to use them as offsets against fossil fuel emissions? Absolutely not. And does the screen come back? Okay, good. So first point. Okay, my screen here flickers, so I turn around. The temporary carbon storage does not have any long-term climate benefits in terms of global mean temperature. Once the carbon that you store on land is either not additional anymore, it would be there anyway, or is not permanent, goes up in flames again, then there are no long-term benefits. So if you offset fossil fuel emissions with this, the climate is worse off in the future with that scheme. The time also that is going beyond nature-based solution, if you just think about a hydropower or a solar wind farm or wind power that are also be able to generate ACCUs, the time for those abatement offsets is actually over. There was a good time when those projects were more expensive than fossil fuel projects and you needed more investment in those. But today, thanks to the changed economics, most of the zero emission technologies are actually the cheaper technologies. So therefore, we don't need additional finance in order to make them. They're not additional anymore. The only thing that can now offset in a net zero or towards a net zero world that can offset remaining emissions is negative emissions if we actually pull emissions out of the atmosphere again. We can't, if we do the accounting simply by saying University of Melbourne is climate active, is carbon neutral because we support hydropower, then at best we get to half emissions of both the hydropower and the University of Melbourne, but we will never get to net zero because the University of Melbourne still has remainder emissions and the hydropower has at best zero emissions, so there are still emissions going into the atmosphere. So at best we are going to get to half global emissions if we do this kind of abatement offset accounting that we at the moment have. If we want to go to a net zero world, the only offset that there is actually permanent removal of CO2 out of the atmosphere if you put another emission in. That also leads to the point of the time for CCS. We need some CCS in some shape or form in the long term to do these permanent removals into geological storage, for example. Yes, there's enhanced weathering and some other techniques, but mainly it needs to be either sustainable biomass with CCS or DAX, which is the direct air capture with CCS, but it needs to be divorced from fossil fuels. At the moment, CCS and fossil fuels are the bedfellows together, and that is also creating a lot of public resentment against CCS for the right reasons, because they never pull off zero emissions. At best, they lower the emissions of fossil fuels. But so CCS has to come out of the bed with fossil fuels, and it has to be then researched and implemented in a sustainable way with some BECCS and some DAX for the remainder emissions. Of course, the main focus should still be on reducing emissions in the first place. I said the other bits we need. So irrespective of that offsetting fossil fuel emissions with nature-based solutions is not good science because the climate is worse off in the end. Of course, we shouldn't forget that, as I said in the beginning, many of these activities that are nature-based solutions do really good stuff in terms of biodiversity and land management. So we might want to find either other ways or be cognizant of the fact that, okay, this money pot doesn't help the climate, but it helps maybe other things. And so maybe we still want to do them, but we shouldn't fool ourselves that for the long-term climate, we're going to support it. And just going on one point, the effect of temporary carbon storage. The slide was animated. I don't know, it's the pointer, it's not working. Anyway, you see in the top graph just the carbon storage in your forest. Then in the second line, you see the CO2 concentration impact. So if you pull out temporary carbon out of the atmosphere, then first you reduce the CO2 concentration that kind of re-equilibrates with the ocean and the terrestrial biosphere a little bit. And then at the end of it, you see this peak coming up over here. When the carbon goes back into the atmosphere, then there's higher CO2 concentration than what it would have been otherwise, simply because of the temporary carbon storage. And for temperature, it goes back to zero. But that is not yet including the effects of the fossil fuels. If you now add a fossil fuel emission on top, then you can see we're starting at zero here, and then we add the effect of the fossil fuel emission. And so in the long term, the climate is worse off if we do offsets compared to we don't do offsets and we avoid the fossil fuel emission in the first place. That also means in short terms, 25-year carbon storage is not permanent, 100 years is not permanent, but as you can see, and here I took a snapshot out of the Australian relevant legislation, if you store carbon for 100 years, you get full credit. It's assumed in Australia to be permanent. If you store it for 25 years, you get a 20% discount, but it's assumed to be almost as good as permanent offset, which is not based on good science. And in most jurisdictions around the world, you don't have that weird contorted definition of permanence. However, I must say there's also a current debate in the UNFCCC with the so-called 10-year accounting. If you want to read up more on it, it's somewhat technical, but there's also the people who want to sell the carbon credits who have a lot in favor of 10-year accounting, but again, it's not based on good science. It's simply contradicting the basic science of cumulative emissions causing temperature in the long term. Let's see, here's the further reading. I hope the slide's getting distributed. So if you want to read further, then you can look there. I hand over to my colleague, Kate.
And just to confirm that we will be sharing the slides with all of the audience members after the presentation.
Great, thank you, Malta. So, oh, okay, I have to click. That's me. Okay, so as Malta made clear, nature-based offsets aren't based on good science in terms of they don't actually contribute to climate mitigation. And I just wanted to very briefly go through some of the history, the sort of political history of why we have so many policy frameworks from the international level to every every nation state with climate targets and a climate policy framework. Why are nature-based offsets so embedded in our climate policy? So, so that screen is distracting, isn't it? So this goes back to the Kyoto Protocol, which negotiated back in the 90s, late 90s. And initially, land, carbon, forest wasn't part of the Kyoto Protocol. It focused on Annex 2 gases. I think it's Annex 2 anyway. It focused on greenhouse gases. And the idea was for developed countries to abate those greenhouse gases. And then very late in the day, there was a push from the US, Australia, countries like that to bring in for afforestation, reforestation, and avoided deforestation shouldn't be in there. Anyway, to bring in afforestation and reforestation as effectively offsets that countries could reduce their emissions through growing forests and offsetting that against their targets for reducing their fossil fuel emissions. So the EU was very opposed to this. Several countries were opposed because it undermined the integrity of the Kyoto Protocol to have this ability to take carbon out of the atmosphere as in substitute for reducing emissions. It got through because it made targets for countries easier to meet. So Japan in particular was sort of one of the last countries who agreed to it because it made their sort of, they could take on a higher target thinking that they could offset it with forests. So anyway, this is the language from the Kyoto Protocol. Well, one of the articles, there's a few, and then there's a lot of rules. In fact, there were then 2 decades of negotiating the rules around what is called LULUCF, land use, change and forestry, because the rules are so complicated and actually full of loopholes and allowed countries lots of opportunities to cheat. Mostly only, most countries didn't do so much cheating except Australia. Then we got to the Paris Agreement, and there was a huge push from a lot of quarters, but particularly climate scientists, I would say, to have something that reflected the concept of net zero in the Paris Agreement long-term goal. And the reason for this is scientifically sound, as in net zero greenhouse gas emissions is what we need to do to stabilize atmospheric concentrations and warming. So there was a lot of back and forth around this language. What should this language be? How should it be phrased? And in the end, net zero wasn't included there. Countries found that was language that they didn't understand, didn't know what the definition or what it meant. And so we got this language here, a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks, which is actually the same language as in the Kyoto Protocol, which makes sense because you can adopt language from one treaty to another. But the big difference was the placement of this language in the Paris Agreement. So this is now in the long-term global goal, the main objective of the Paris Agreement. There are no limits or constraints. The use of sinks in the Kyoto Protocol was very, very constrained, extremely limited. No constraints with how this is in the Paris Agreement, this idea of balancing. I do argue, and I think the idea, like the second half of this paragraph, which isn't talked about as much, is that this has to be achieved on the basis of equity and poverty eradication and in line with sustainable development goals. So you could say that that's the sort of constraints on how we balance sources and sinks. But what this did was move sort of the idea of nature-based offsets into the center of the Paris Agreement, and the idea that net zero could be achieved through just lots of sinks and removals instead of actually reducing emissions. Now, this wasn't what the climate scientists had in mind when they were pushing for net zero in the Paris Agreement. And so then we had several years of sort of efforts from the science community to to say what net zero actually should look like, what credible net zero goals are. Net zero does not mean offsetting all your emissions while you continue to burn fossil fuels. And I think that the best example of this actually happened, was it last week or in the last month? Just recently, we had the advice from the European Scientific Advisory Board to the Commission on their 2040 climate targets, which the EU is starting to negotiate now. And they came with very, very strong advice saying that Europe should be reducing its emissions by 90 to 95% by 2040, which shows you the kind of scale of emission reductions compared to the potential removals that need to be in a credible net zero goal. So that's the first thing to understand about net zero. And now I'm running out of time, so I'll just do this one very quickly. What I just wanted to talk about here, so as well as land offsets being a problem because they enable continued fossil fuel use and then we don't reduce emissions and we don't act on climate change, they also set up perverse incentives for what we might actually want to do in terms of good land management. So the first thing here, protecting primary forests and intact ecosystems. In terms of the land sector, land management, and in terms of land's role in climate change, contributing to mitigating climate change, the most important thing is that we keep intact forests standing. There aren't that many, there's not an extensive area of intact primary forests left on the planet and other intact ecosystems. And so from both the climate and biodiversity perspective, that is the #1 priority. But in terms of carbon accounting, carbon accounting doesn't incentivize to do that, because what we get if we just value the forest for the carbon is avoided deforestation credits, avoided emissions. Now, these have no integrity because they're based on a counterfactual baseline of what might have happened, might we have cut down the forest, then we get credits, And finally, the sort of carbon market community who are in a current effort to pull the market up out of the fraudulent place it's been for a few decades and create high integrity credits. This has resulted in excluding, it's just the start of a trend, but across several sort of governance standards and carbon market accounting standards, we're seeing avoided emissions being excluded from accounting because there's no integrity to those, that accounting methodology. But where does that leave, in particular, poorer developing countries, tropical forest countries, they're called HFLD, high forest, low deforestation countries, in terms of income or incentives or financial incentives or support to keep their forests standing. So carbon accounting rules don't deliver that. The next thing they do in terms of a perverse incentive, and I will wrap up very quickly, is we get a focus on tree planting over things like ecosystem restoration. So tree planting, because carbon accounting focuses on fluxes, not stocks, tree planting can give you this quick flux drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere. And so there's been a huge trend the last few years or more to think about how many billions of hectares of tree planting we could do around the globe and how that would draw down carbon. So maybe the only other thing to say on this slide, the graphic there is quite useful just in terms of we need a solution to all of this is separating out targets for emission reductions versus removals. So if we had separate targets for those two things, we wouldn't be offsetting one for the other and we could properly incentivize the different actions that need to happen. And then I have a slide on Australian climate policy, but I think I'll skip it because I've gone for too long and we can come back to it in discussion.
Thank you very much, Kate, and we will certainly have time to come back to that policy perspective on these issues as well. Rowan, I'm hoping that you're online and I can see your smiling face or almost smiling face online. So I'm going to hand over to you now and you get to give your sort of, initial 7-minute presentation.
Great. Thanks, Dave. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Alice Springs, where I live and work, the Aranda people, and I come from the Wandunna clan of the Butchulla people, traditional owners of Gurry, Fraser Island. There's always a good argument, I suppose, for making good the enemy of perfect, and that's why the Greens voted down the CPRS, the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, 10, 12 years ago. And so we had no official scheme because they wanted it to be perfect. And so they voted it down and we had nothing. until the Albanese government passed the legislation quite recently. And I think there's a danger in people being a little bit too purist in their views, and therefore we end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The way that we view carbon is that they're the icing on the cake. The cake is the environmental, social and cultural values. That is the reason why we go carbon farming. If we get that right, we'll also get some carbon credits. So our focus is very much on the cake, the environmental, social and cultural values. And the carbon credits are a nice bonus along the way, but it's all around good project management. Now, this feeds into what they refer to now as high integrity carbon credits. And that's a welcome move that we've been advocating for in the industry. And we're certainly helping the Timor-Leste government develop their programs around high integrity schemes. I'll just move to the next slide. What we tend to have is an over emphasis on simply carbon, and everything else is seen as second rate. It's all about emission reductions. It's all about the carbon credits. And so you end up getting this very narrow tunnel vision, which I think it's a very European way of looking at the world, where it's very singular, it's very focused, and it doesn't take into account all of the other aspects of why you'd go carbon farming. So, for example, one of the outcomes that's been achieved in Cape York has been a 50% reduction in bushfires in an entire region. I'll say that again, a 50% reduction in bushfires. So when people argue about methodologies, and no one's arguing about that one in particular, but if they did, and they said that, oh, we should remove those abatement mechanisms, what they're really arguing for is a return to the old days where Cape York used to go up in flames and we had massive wildfires causing a lot of damage and destruction. And I don't think that's good for anyone. Certainly not good for the environment. So through carbon farming, savanna burning, we've managed to achieve a 50% reduction in Cape York. And I think it's around about the same across Northern Australia as well, but I'd have to double check those stats. I see carbon farming as part of a natural connected system where carbon credits is simply one of the carbon credits are an output, and the outcomes are really the management of country and all of the biodiversity that comes with it. I was at the Paris Agreement, and it was a very positive step forward that the world took. It's going to take a lot of time and effort to get it all right. Methodologies will need to be improved over time and developed. We haven't had a lot of new methodologies coming through the system of late, and that is of concern. The savanna burning methodology, the original one, that took 12 years to develop and cost $10 million. That's the type of scientific rigor that we need to apply here. At least 12 years of research, 12 years of R&D went into that methodology. And we can be doing similar things, but I just don't see the investment in the R&D that's required for the various methodologies that we need within Australia. The blue carbon methodology was certainly a step forward, but its applicability is very, very limited. It's very, very narrow. Work's now being undertaken for a Mark II that has broader application. Whilst the blue carbon methodology, it sounds sexy from a scientific perspective, its application is very narrow. And so when you have broad-based methodologies, the integrated farm methodology, which is coming through the system, which will be applicable to maybe 50, 60% of arid lands in Australia, if not more, they're the types of methodologies that we need to be investing in, where there's broad applicability across a range of areas. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that, if that's okay, Dave.
Thank you very much, Rowan. And what I'm going to do now is ask essentially the same questions or group of questions, one at a time, to each of the panel members. And I may indicate perhaps who should go first, but actually for the very first two, I'm going to ask you all, maybe in the same order as we went before, Malte and then Kate and then Rowan, to think about what are the potential co-benefits, not just in terms of carbon and climate, but the co-benefits in some of the things that Rowan, you talked about, the broader environmental, cultural and social benefits of nature-based carbon offsets in things like agriculture, ecosystems, biodiversity, even in terms of agriculture, water resources, forestry, ecosystems, or anything else, but particularly human well-being, or even reducing temperature extremes in rural and city environments. Malte, you first, briefly.
If we talk about co-benefits, then I suppose the benefit is a climate benefit. And so I think we are all relatively much on the same page, and Rowan also highlighted quite a few nice co-benefits. And I don't think that is really the main question, or is not questioned by anybody, that there are great co-benefits if implemented properly. Of course, you can also plant a eucalypt monoculture plantation in Chile, and then you won't have much co-benefits for anything else except for some carbon that is temporarily stored in those. But again, I don't think there is much disagreement that if implemented properly, either as Rowan pointed out, there can be lots of great benefits for biodiversity, for land management, et cetera, and for example, the reduced fire rates that Rowan mentioned. There's no question. The question is, that I addressed at least, was, is there a benefit, and not about the co-benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we all agree that there's a lot of benefits from these sorts of activities and I guess one way to put it, like I could go and talk about different specific things, different types of nature-based, what's being called solutions. But one way to think of it might be around carbon and biodiversity. So carbon is effectively the building block for biodiversity, and the more diverse an ecosystem, the better it will hold on to and retain the carbon in that ecosystem. And the same can be said for farming and agricultural practices. Carbon in soils obviously improves the soil health, improves productivity. So keeping carbon in the ground, in trees, in ecosystems, and keeping those ecosystems diverse and healthy benefits both the climate and biodiversity, which is another crisis. But counting the carbon and making it commensurable with fossil fuel emissions is where the problem lies.
Thanks, Kate. And Rowan, you've probably addressed some of this already, but would you like to go back to sort of maybe talking more specifically about some of the cultural and social values that you as, you know, an Indigenous person sees for Indigenous communities out of potential carbon or nature-based carbon offsets?
We refer to those values as being core benefits. So they're the core, so the environmental, social and cultural core benefits. We don't refer to them as co-benefits. That language is becoming much more accepted in the CMI conference in Cairns. I noted several speakers referred to core benefits. And that's where we say that the carbon credit, the ACCUs, are actually the co-benefit. So the reason why we go carbon farming is to achieve good management of country, to maintain the biodiversity, to obtain an income and jobs, to ensure that sacred sites are managed. And fire is very much about bringing people together. It's very much a strong cultural affirmation of traditional ownership of country. This is my country, I therefore burn it. It's a very strong sign of that. I was actually in Lockhart River last week, just with some of the traditional owners of the Land Trust up there doing cultural burning. It's a very positive program. It's something that when you experience it, it really is an eye-opener. But I think, you know, we need to move away from this idea that it's simply just all about producing a commodity, a carbon credit. Yes, that is important. That is part of the mix by all means, but it's not the. It's like talking to a farmer and just saying, and if you go to basically any farmer really, and you say, look, we all know the reason why you're farming is simply to make money. You know, it's all about making money. That's all it is, isn't it? You know, you're just here to rip as much goodness out of the country so you can make as much profit as possible. And then the farmer will say, no, I love this country. I'm looking after this country. Yes, the farm needs to be economically viable, but the reason I'm here is not simply profit driven. The reason why carbon projects exist should not simply be carbon driven. It's the same equation. Carbon farming is not just about carbon credits, and farming is not just about making money. You know, it's about a broad suite of outcomes. And that's why I say it's the icing on the cake. And I might add that social acceptability, and this is more goes to social core benefits, where your activities are accepted, respected, and rewarded within your regional community brings sustainability. So if you want to get to 100 years, that means the people in the local town have to like you. If you walk down the street and people spit on you, you will not be there for 100 years. You'll be there for 1 year and then you'll pack up and leave. Like, you know, I just don't know. I don't, you know, like, where do you think these projects are located? They're located in regional and rural Australia. People need to accept what you're doing. Otherwise, you'll be driven out of town. You won't have any staff because no one accepts what you're doing. So the social core benefits are critical to getting to 100 years because we want long-term sustainable projects that are going to be there for a century. And if you're not socially acceptable within your local community, you'll last 1 year. You won't last 100 years. And that's the critical factor here. To get to permanence, you need social respectability. Otherwise, people, and this is what happened in the last term of government, they'll ring up the minister, they'll email the minister, they'll tell them that you're not welcome, you're not accepted, and they will change the rules, as the minister did. That's what happens. Everyone has an email. They will change the rules because there's no social acceptability. So, you know, people tend to think it's a little bit soft, social core benefits. But if you're going to be around for 100 years, you need to be respected within your local community, black or white. People need to support what you're doing and see a benefit to it. And then you will have permanence.
Thanks a lot, Rowan. That's very important, you know, perspectives and considerations that need to be borne in mind. We've already covered quite a lot on the, if you like, issues or negative aspects of nature-based, or limitations perhaps is a better word to use for the nature-based carbon offsets. But another critical issue, in addition to permanence and additionality, is scalability. What is the potential, or what each of you think is the potential for nature-based emission reductions to go even make a substantial contributions to negative emissions, and then to go from zero emissions to enough negative emissions to get back to cooling global temperatures by 1 degree Celsius? Is that achievable by scaling up nature-based offsets. Can nature-based offsets be scaled up that much? Do we have enough land or ocean without the adverse impacts of temperature extremes?
Thank you. And briefly coming back to what Varun said, I like the language of core benefits. And I think in the Australian context, this is really what these carbon farming initiatives are about. And so if we agree, maybe then the ACCUs should be renamed from Australian carbon credit units to Australian LMUs, land management units, or something else to make that clear. These are the core benefits, and that's why we do it, and that's why we have a $1 billion fund, and that's why we all agree we should spend that money. It's not to allow another Santos gas project or another fossil fuel emissions to go ahead without making sizable efforts to then reducing emissions. So I think disentangling that and calling them core benefits, and yes, if there are climate benefits long-term, that's even better, but this is not then the currency in which it is traded and offset against fossil fuel emissions, then this is perfect. Of course, the little problem is then also internationally always, at the moment, the money sits in the climate sphere. That's where the money comes from. That's why many activities are geared towards the climate. But I think in the Australian context, with the very good connection to the land, I think there's a lot of public acceptability to say, hey, we have $1 billion fund for land management, for everything. Anyway, that just as a follow-up note, I think on the question of scalability, the nature-based solution traditionally and how they are also included in the ACCU at the moment, they are not durable long-term emission reductions or removals that really help the climate in the very long term. So I don't think there's a question of scalability of something that is good to do, but doesn't really help. So what we do need is the durable, long-term permanent removals, and they are geological sequestration. They are maybe a bit biochar, but there are many questions about it. But it is then in combination with sustainable BECCS and CCS, or direct air capture, even better with CCS, or mineralization, etc. But these are the things, and whether they can be scaled, well, to many models, they started out with quite a few gigatons, let's say up to 10 gigatons per year of removals. Kate did a lot of studies about what the sustainable potentials are, and I guess a few gigatons on the global scale per year could be pulled off, but we have to march in that direction. But again, few gigatons a year compared to around 40 gigatons at the moment, there's no question about it. We need to get to the primary goal first, which is reducing fossil fuel emissions to start with.
Yep. So I published a paper last year with Zebedee and Malta, where we came up with somewhere between 1 and 2 gigatons a year of removals on a global scale. And it had no impact on reducing peak warming because we reached the peak too soon. It takes too long to scale up carbon drawdown in regrowth of plants and forest. And even by the end of the century, we had an effect of 1/10 of a degree of reducing warming, and that wouldn't be a long-term effect, as Malta was saying. But I wanted to come back to your question in a different way in terms of scalability and land. And I think what is really important, and what's been underpinning my work for quite a few years, is thinking about land use and the pressure that we put on land. So already we've surpassed the planetary boundaries for land use, for conversion of natural lands to permanent cropland is one way that's measured. So I'm talking about sort of that kind of land use, that conversion of natural lands that's a problem, not the way, for example, Indigenous peoples use lands, or more mixed methods of farming that exist in some cultures. So we already put too much pressure on land, and to add climate mitigation that relies on land, we don't have the spare land for it at all. There's no spare land at all. And it's interesting that sustainable BECCS is now a terminology. And I think this, I mean, yes, we need geological permanent removals, but how we get that from BECCS without putting pressure on land and without land use to grow that bioenergy is a big challenge and a big question. And there was, anyway, I'll stop there because I forgot the other thing I was going to say, but we need to be really careful about how we use land. There isn't spare land.
Kate, one thing we can do with geological storage is grow trees, cut them down and put them in old coal mines, because that will be geological storage. But it takes a long time and it doesn't generate energy while you're doing it. So it's not BECCS, it's a joke solution.
It sounds like a terrible idea.
It is indeed. It is a terrible idea. Rowan, over to you and scalability of the core social values in increasing it. And it is clear that, if you like, the colonial impact on Australia has major adverse impacts on the environmental, cultural and social values.
Yeah, that's true. True, Dave. I think we need to move away from the eco-colonial approach that we take to Australia at the moment. So what I mean by that is, I think it's 54% of the Australian landmass is under either direct control and management by the traditional owners. So just over half of Australia. And the other, if it's not direct, they have native title rights and interests. So either direct or indirect, Indigenous people have either management, control or use of approximately 54% of Australia. So that's a massive resource. However, it's only until the CHOB review that they came through with a recommendation that an Indigenous person should be on the ERAC committee, the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, despite the fact that we have significant interests in this, and we have over 30 carbon farming projects in Australia. I think it was about 35. And I think we're the fourth biggest producer of ACCUs within the carbon industry. So we're a significant player, not only in generation of carbon credits, but also in terms of ownership and use of land. Eligible interest holder consent is required, but we don't have the mechanisms to achieve good negotiated outcomes. It's very clunky, it's difficult. Only recently we had a change to the system where eligible interest holder consent is now required at the start of a project, not halfway through. So it's these sorts of eco-colonial approaches within Australia that we're starting to fix up. We're starting to get there. Scalability, so you can access a lot of land in Australia if you go about it the right way. But the other thing is that we just don't have the methodologies. Like, I think we've got 35, 36 methodologies at the moment. We should have 40 or 50 methodologies. So we just don't have the investment in R&D. So there's a couple of new ones coming through. So the integrated farm methodology, the improved native forest management methodology. There's an ungulate one, which is hoofed animals, blue carbon. So, there's 3 or 4, and there are other methodologies coming through the system, but we don't have enough tools in the toolkit to get the job done. The tools are very limited, and the process of accessing land is very clunky. Like I said, that didn't even have a First Nations person on the ERAC committee until, they're interviewing at the moment. And I mean, just on that, I'll just put in a side bit here. The biodiversity scheme, they haven't even undertaken First Nations consultations with the Senate inquiry. They were scheduled to hold them, but they haven't. They were put on the back burner. So, and I think that's indicative of the world internationally, where Indigenous rights and interests are seen very much as being second rate. So it's interesting to see with countries where they're really starting to promote this work, and it's a natural vehicle for many Indigenous people to be involved in these projects. That they go hand in glove. But the main thing is access to land, and more methodologies are required.
Thanks a lot, Rowan, and thanks to all the panel members so far. What I'm going to do now is go to some questions from the audience here in the room. But first of all, I'm going to go to a couple of the questions. Well, one question from the online audience, and then I'll have a question from the room, and we'll alternate questions. Often the questions that I can see online are addressed or most likely to be relevant to one of the panel members. So I'm going to probably address them specifically to a single panel member, but I have no idea who is going to be able to answer the very first one, because it's got some support from additional people online. And the first question is, can any of you, Rowan or Kate or Malte, talk about an example of a successful nature-based carbon offset that has quantifiable magnitude offsets that have actually worked, i.e. led to uptake of carbon from the atmosphere into the system. Now, I think there are some nature-based ones, but I don't know whether this should be addressed to you, Rowan, or to Kate, or to Malte. So who would like to go first? A specific, quantified example that worked.
Well, I'll go first if you like. I've got heaps of examples.
Fantastic, go ahead.
Western Yalanji Aboriginal Corporation on Palmerville Station, a large cattle station in Cape York that generated carbon credits and strong environmental, social and cultural core benefits. Wilbur Land Trust next door, got Lockhart River, which is coming online, Fish River in the Northern Territory, Kalinchapa near just north of Tennant Creek. There are numerous carbon projects throughout regional and rural Australia. And I'm talking about specifically Indigenous projects here, by the way.
That's absolutely fine. And were those credits primarily associated with savanna burning type? Yeah. So that's what I thought they might be. And that's important. But I guess the follow-up part of that is a reduction in nature-based emissions from savanna burning to a reduced emission from human activity. Can you offset, if you like, natural fires, which don't count to human emissions, by actual human management? Now, I think the atmosphere will benefit from those offsets, but is it a chicken and egg? Well, not even chicken and egg. Is it counting the things the same way? Because one set is nature-based emissions and the other one is human-caused management. But what are your thoughts on that? Is it appropriate?
Well, you need to read this is the thing that I find is that people don't actually understand the methodologies involved. And like, you actually need to sit down and actually read the methodologies and work with them. So with savanna burning, it's both sequestration and abatement. So that's the 2018 methodology. And so where that works quite well across Northern Australia, the reason being is because we have both of those elements at play, sequestration and abatement. So, you know, most veg projects are based on sequestration. So savanna burning, 50% of it is sequestration, which means the trees are still alive. After you put the fire through, the trees are still alive, still sequestering carbon. That's where that comes from. Like, you know, the trees are not dead. They're still, you know, sequestering carbon. But, you know, look, there's an broader argument around the veg, you know, HIR, for example. And, you know, around accuracy of full cam and making sure the measurements are as accurate as possible. And I believe that methodologies should be constantly improved. I look at them like vehicles, you know, like this model vehicle is better than the last model, which is better than the last one before. A system of continual improvement, you know, where you start off with good, start off with 7 out of 10, and over time you get to 10 out of 10. Yeah. You know, there's nothing wrong with, you know, with that. But people want perfection. And I think that's why we had 10 years in the wilderness. is because unless it was perfect, then the Greens were going to vote it down, which happened. And then we were left for 10 years wandering around in the wilderness because it wasn't absolutely perfect. And I just think that's a complete nonsense. Anyway.
Thanks, Rowan. Kate, do you have any examples that you can think of where there's been successful nature-based offsets?
No, but I just want to answer the question slightly. There was a paper published just last week, I think, by Tim Searchinger from Princeton University. That's a very, very good paper looking at the impact of reduced wood harvest. And so effectively ending native forest logging, and they quantified the potential globally for sequestration from that forest regrowing. And I think it was something like 3 times the global emissions of aviation. And what they argue in that paper is we shouldn't be logging native forests. We should be letting those forests regrow, huge biodiversity and benefits for people. And then changing how we think about wood products, intensifying existing plantations, so we could actually triple the amount of wood we do get from plantations without touching natural forests. So I think this is a really good example, and it's one where there's huge potential globally to draw down carbon back into trees, and it has a climate benefit. It's just not a benefit that justifies fossil fuel emissions. It still draws carbon down though.
Sure.
In light of the planetary boundaries, we've got multiple competing crises. There isn't one crisis, and we have to deal with them at the same time. So if we draw down carbon by weaning ourselves off fossil fuels and putting solar panels across the land, what does that solve? It plays one crisis off another crisis, I guess is the point. So in terms of the panel, what are the ways that you see in your own work to resolve that dilemma of competing crises rather than just one?
And he's next to me. So Malta, why don't you go first, and then I'll go to Kate, and then I'll go to Rowan. How do you address the competing crises and address them all at once immediately?
But coming to this very specific panels on solar utility scale farm on the land outside, which you see now in Europe on large scale, you see it in China, you see it here. And I share with you the slightest comfort that there's land, arable land, fruitful land used up with just low-lying solar panels, which to me, it doesn't have to be that way. If the solar panels are put on stilts 2 meters high, then it can be still a great way to have livestock underneath, or to even farm there, etc. A bit of shading doesn't harm the land. So it can be on lots of the roofs still don't have solar panels, lots of all the warehouses, all the parking lots. Not that you want to give a greenwashing image to the Melbourne airport, but there on the airport, there are huge fields, vast fields. And so it doesn't have to be that way. And I think with any mitigation options that we do, we have to be aware about the other benefits. It can't be that we just have a blank check because something is done for the climate.
Yeah, I think assessing multiple benefits of any policy, but in particular, what I've been talking about for years is a biodiversity first approach. And I guess you could say biodiversity and people first. But if there's a climate mitigation action that negatively impacts on biodiversity, then it's not going to be climate mitigation ultimately, because that feeds back into climate change. And just on that, all of the SSP scenarios in AR5, in AR6, they included some extra different ones. All of the SSP scenarios, even the best ones, all had negative impacts on biodiversity because they relied so much on land for mitigation.
Okay, do you want me to say something?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Right. Well, I think we just need to move away from that tunnel vision on that. You know, we have a very strong tunnel vision around abatement, and you need to realise that everything's connected. The reason why you go, you know, this is a pretty basic thing. The reason why you implement a carbon farming project is to achieve environmental, social, and cultural outcomes. Black or white, that's okay. That's why you do it. Full stop. I want to improve my community. I want to improve the land. I want to do something about climate change. That's why you go carbon farming. And if I get all that right, as a bonus, as the icing on the cake, I'm also going to get a carbon credit. And so the carbon credit becomes the co-benefit, and the environmental, social, and cultural core benefits become the reason why you go carbon farming. But internationally and domestically, the reason why we go carbon farming is to generate carbon credits. And everything else is considered secondary. It's a co-benefit. It's a little piece, it's a little fluffy piece on the side. You know, it's not considered seriously. And yet, that's the strength of these projects. And so it's a very European view of the world, where it's very narrow and it's very laser focused on the carbon credit. And the world doesn't operate like that, you know, and that's where we need to be a lot better placed.
Thanks for that, Rowan. And now let's go back to another one of the questions. And I've got a growing number of questions from online. But I'm going to switch a little bit in perspective. I know Rowan talked about the potential of the blue carbon, not land carbon, but particularly marine carbon potential as one of these other nature-based solutions. Would anyone like to talk about the potential for blue carbon in terms of capturing carbon dioxide, whether it's in mangroves, in coastal regions, or seagrass, or kelp, and whether that is a scalable solution, and also whether it's immune to climate change related temperature extremes in the ocean, because I've been reading about the massive loss of kelp around Australian coastlines associated with temperature extremes. Who would like to have a go at blue carbon? You mentioned it first, Rowan, so I'm going to hand this one to you. Would you like to talk about marine carbon or blue carbon opportunities, and also how scalable they might be?
Sure. Well, the first thing is you need to read the methodology. So I'm not sure how many people have actually read the math, because it's all about removing engineering blocks. So its applicability within Australia is very limited. So you need a mosquito management plan as well, I might add. But it's about removing artificial barriers, engineering blocks, to allow tidal inundation to take place again. The application of that methodology is very, very narrow. You know, there'll probably, you know, look, there are, you know, maybe a dozen sites in Australia where you can physically, based on engineering advice, according to methodology, you can remove the physical barrier based on an engineer's advice to allow tidal inundation to take place again. Now, within southern Australia, there may be places that has taken place. Along the Queensland coast, it could be a couple of cane farms that they put in a block, an engineering block that can be removed. But its application is very, very narrow. So you talk about kelp and you know, seagrass. The blue carbon methodology has got nothing to do with that at all. It's about removing an engineering block. That's what it is. It's got nothing to do with kelp, nothing to do with seagrass, nothing to do with anything else, apart from getting advice from an engineer to allow, you know, the water to come in again. So, you know, it's a lot of time, yeah, look, it's good that we've got it. It's the first step that was taken. It's good. That's good. Now we need to, the second step where we need to customize it to the Australian environment. And that's where we're looking at impacts on the land that then affect the sea. So runoff, you know, so if you've got feral animals and other things, you can do something to avoid that. In the Indo-Pacific, once again, I'm not sure how many engineering, you know, constructions that have been put in place in the Indo-Pacific that can be physically removed based on an engineer's advice. But yeah, I'm sure there's a few, but its applicability is quite limited, and so therefore we need the next methodology to come on board.
Yep. And so, Rowan, it's sort of maybe a summary is that the current blue carbon methodology is quite narrow, and that there isn't one that covers seagrass potential or kelp potential or even mangrove potential in terms of quantified, and therefore more funding and more research is needed to actually come up with methodologies along some of those highly potential but uncertain carbon offsets. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So more funding in R&D, and look, that's taking place at the moment. Kath Lovejoy from UQ, she's leading that work on blue carbon Mark II. Yeah, very good. You know, it's very good. NAILSMA is involved in that as well, working with traditional owners up in Arnhem Way, the North Australia Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance. So, you know, work is being done, but, you know, I don't know where that one went wrong. I mean, maybe they just tried to sort of say, look, if we can just get one up, then that's good enough. But like I say, like it doesn't, you know, I'd say it applies to probably 1% of the Australian coastline. Like it's you know, like I said, where there's an engineering block and you need to remove it. It's very limited in its applicability.
Yep.
I just wanted to add something from sort of outside Australia. So if you're looking like at a global level, the potential for sequestration in blue carbon, basically coastal marine areas is very, very small compared to the terrestrial potential. Even though the coastal and marine areas are more dense, much more carbon dense sort of per acre, there's just less of that area. So it'd be less than a tenth or less than a fifth even on a global scale. But there is, I mean, there are many other reasons. It's such an important zone. Intertidal zones and marine and coastal areas are so important for biodiversity and also for livelihoods and people. There is a lot of focus on it, and in particular, the Green Climate Fund over the last few years was focusing a lot on blue carbon and marine recovery, marine ecosystem recovery projects. And so as a result, a lot of Pacific Island countries, or some, probably not a lot, probably very few actually, have projects via the Green Climate Fund on that, and they have some methodology guidance and not so much methodologies. It's not the same kind of framework. It's not a carbon accounting framework. It's a funding framework. So they don't put out methodologies, but they have some guidance on best practice in that area. And a lot of countries in their NDCs have talked about restoring mangrove areas. So it's happening in other ways outside of sort of the carbon methodology space.
I'm interested to hear, in the context of the Australian government introducing the nature repair market legislation, does the panel have any examples or thoughts on really leading policies that are that sort of biodiversity first type of policy that you described, Kate, that also have really substantial climate impacts?
So, I mean, not examples of good biodiversity policies in Australia, if that was the question. They seem to, there's been a lot of defunding and a lot of rolling back on legislation and problems with conservation and biodiversity in Australia. But in general, I think that And what I was trying to say a little bit when I talked about the carbon accounting rules and the way they give perverse incentives is that focusing on ecosystem restoration. And so a good example of that is just removing harvest of native forests. Then ecosystems restore. So the restoration of degraded ecosystems is actually quite easy to achieve. We just need to remove the sort of industrial or degrading disturbances, and they will regenerate. And that's much easier than replanting or replacing a lost ecosystem, which is also why maintaining, like not further losing and degrading ecosystems is so important.
Rowan, do you have a perspective on the nature positive or nature and biodiversity market bills that are being suggested or attempted to be implemented within the Australian parliamentary system at present by the federal government?
Sure, and we made a submission with Melbourne Climate Futures at Melbourne Uni, and I'd like to give a shout out to Lily O'Neill, who helped us write that submission. That was very good. Yeah, I suppose the overall bill is an example of what not to do. If you're across this issue, you know this came from the National Party. It came out about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, and the National Party are now opposing it, I believe, in the Senate. That's where the originated from. A lot of people in the industry were very surprised at the rushing it through, the haste that, you know, proper consultation hasn't been undertaken. It hasn't been well thought out. There's a lot of concerns around it. You know, there's no talk of cultural fire, no talk of cultural water, and they're the two big elements within Australia, is water and fire, and they just don't take those into consideration at all. The other one is I'm just going to go into a little bit now, the pricing mechanism. So it's one certificate per project, so one certificate per farm, and then the next one is, okay, well, what's the pricing mechanism? How much is a certificate going to cost? Nobody knows, and nobody knows how to price it either. And so, you know, it's unclear how it's actually going to operate. How much money you're going to pay for a biodiversity certificate? No one knows. What's the pricing mechanism based on? Nobody knows. Where's the verification of the environmental, social, and cultural outcomes? As far as I can see, like there isn't one. Like, you know, that they have plans, but there's no actual verification. It's like, okay, so you've planned to do this, but what has actually happened here? You know, it's been rushed through. It's been ill-conceived. It's been a bit of a patch-up job from the National Party, from where they started working on this 18 months, 2 years ago. You know, the Clean Energy Regulator is not in a place where it can actually manage this project. If you ever dealt with the CER, you know that they struggle to manage the carbon industry. You know, let alone loading them up with something else. They just don't have the staff. They just don't have the people to actually do it. Like, if you go to the Clean Energy Regulator, which we will be going, and I've known these people for a long time, they just don't actually have the people in there. They just don't actually have the people with the expertise or the grunt to actually get this job done. It's just not well thought out, and there's a lot of concerns, not only from First Nations but also from the conservation sector. And you can go online and read all of their submissions. It's an interesting read. I've read several of them. Everyone's concerned about it. The National Party blocking this is actually a perverse outcome, which actually might lead to better outcomes, because the way it's crafted at the moment is ill-conceived.
Thank you, Rowan, for that perspective, which is a really important one. We're running out of time, and I'm going to go to another question. I think I can address this one to Malta, who's been quiet most recently. It's another one from the online talks, and it says, if I summarize it or paraphrase it, given the permanence issues around nature-based carbon offsets, if we look at some of the nature-based solutions that might, as you described and as Kate described, have a sort of 20 to 25 year capturing or offsetting, but not for carbon dioxide, but then for a shorter lived greenhouse gas like methane, could some nature-based, if you like, offsets be appropriate for thinking about for offsetting methane emissions short-term, while the methane emissions from, for instance, fossil gas or something like that are stopped?
Very good question, thank you. And yes, that makes sense. And it also makes sense from who are the stakeholders. If, for example, in the New Zealand setting, if you have the plantations or the trees on the farm and you have the methane emissions from the livestock, then putting that into one accounting bubble and having potentially temporary carbon storage accounted to offset these short-lived emissions makes perfect sense. We also have means in the international scheme to deal with non-permanence, recognizing that these temporary solutions, they are temporary, either after 50 or 100 years or 200 years, the thing is either not additional anymore, and then it's thereby not permanent, or the carbon is reversed, then it's not permanent. But there are ways to deal with it on an accounting basis as well. And that's why the international scheme has the so-called temporary CERs, the TCERs. And I was involved in the negotiation of this accounting scheme when I was back then in the European team. And we I think it's a very robust system, because you get your credit, but at the end of the lifetime of, for example, 25 years, you have to show that either the carbon is still there or you have to replace that expiring credit. And then you get an equivalent of avoided fossil fuel emissions towards these a string of temporary carbon projects. And then also carbon science or climate scientists are happy. The issue, of course, is then that you much reduce the market value of these credits, because you kind of sell both the offsetting but also the liability to replace that expiring credit after its lifetime. And the market value was much reduced. Not many of the afforestation, reforestation projects under the Kyoto Protocol took off. And this is why there's now a huge push from also a lot of the carbon industry to turn that rather into a 10-year accounting approach, etc., to give higher market value, which, yes, it will give higher market value, it will get more projects off the ground, but it will undermine the scientific integrity of these projects. The atmosphere in the end will be worse off. And let's not forget, if we don't get the climate crisis in check, then lots of the biodiversity that we are talking about, whether it's our coastal regions or inland regions, are going to suffer climate extremes beyond 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 degrees. And it will be a different phase of the planet that we are going to have. So anything talking about biodiversity, getting fossil fuel emissions down first is also there, should be one of the highest objectives. Of course, recognizing that we shouldn't do mitigation by creating disbenefits for biodiversity in the first place.
Malte, I'm going to take that as your sort of wrap-up statement, and I'm going to go, because we've basically used up all of our time, I'm going to go to Kate and then to Rowan to give a sort of, if you like, a 1-minute concluding remarks, if you wish to, about what you think are the key messages you'd like to put to our in-person audience and our online audience, if you like, from the panel discussion.
Okay, thanks, David. I feel like I repeated several things I said already, so hopefully my key messages are clear. I wanted to add one new thing that we didn't get to, which is thinking about the finance alternatives and finance and the investment sort of architecture. I think that sometimes in these conversations we can get too focused on where the carbon market is at the moment is very focused on high integrity offsets, how to improve the carbon market. And if we look outside that box, or if we think about what this is about, and also in terms of the nature repair bill, why does someone buy one of these nature credits, whatever they're going to be called? Who buys it? An investor buys it because they want to destroy biodiversity somewhere. And so they buy that credit to offset their destruction of biodiversity. And a carbon credit is the same. Who buys it? Somebody who wants to emit fossil fuels, a company or a country. And this is not how we're going, on a large scale, this is not how we're going to solve the climate crisis. It's also not the most effective and efficient way to drive money into what are really good projects and where money is needed. And so on the one hand, we need to be thinking more about ending destructive subsidies, controlling development better. That's how we would protect biodiversity better, and how to fund good land management and the sorts of things Rowan's talking about. A panel I was on recently, we came to the conclusion of an ecosystem services tax would be more efficient and effective and scalable than a carbon market.
Thanks, Kate. And I completely agree with that, because it touches on almost all of the environmental, cultural and social core values that Rowan was talking about. But over to you, Rowan. Did you want to, if you like, have the final words on this from your perspective?
Sure, thanks, Dave. I'd just like to finish off on the blue carbon point, in that there is a question mark over the ownership of that, and this is in treaty negotiations. So in treaty negotiations, ownership of the intertidal zone and the blue carbon credits that are generated from that may not rest with the Crown. And that's, so the issuance of carbon credits from a blue carbon project may actually be faulty, because the Crown in treaty negotiations may not ultimately have the right to issue those carbon credits, because it's a natural resource that the First Nations may own. So they'll be issuing them. Look, the final point I'd just like to make is that there is a difference between compliance and integrity. The word integrity gets thrown around a lot, and the way I sort of put it, it's a bit like my son coming to me, and he got his driver's license recently, and he said, "Oh, Dad, I'm a really good driver now. I've got a driver's license." I said, "No, I want you to become a good driver, but you're a licensed driver. You're not necessarily a good driver. Over time, you'll become a good driver." So getting your methodology ticked by public servants in Canberra gives you compliance. It does not give you integrity. Integrity is another whole set of questions. So if you have compliance with the methodology, the public servants and the regulator have ticked off on it, great. You've complied with the rules. That's all you've done. Nothing more, nothing less. It's got nothing to do with integrity at all. Integrity is another set of questions. And I just think we need to be a little bit careful around saying things have integrity when they don't. Integrity relates to values and ethics. We just need to be mindful of these things. Going to Canberra and getting your methodology or your project ticked off is good, but it has got nothing to do with integrity at all. Look, nature-based solutions are heading in the right direction. We need, the reason for the uptake in most First Nations and other, well-meaning people is because they want to benefit the land. They want to benefit the community. They want to benefit the next generation. That's why they're doing it. And they also want to be economically viable at the same time. That's the approach that we need to take. But this focus on, carbon, like this tunnel vision on carbon, and everything else is secondary, it's never worked. It's never worked. You go to any project in the world where they have a single focus and nothing else mattered. It's a short-lived project. And that's where you need social respectability. You need people to accept what you're doing. And that's around integrity. That's not compliance with Canberra, that's integrity. If people buy into your integrity, then you will be there for 100 years because people get what you're doing. And that's the trick to it.
Thanks, Rowan. And can you just let me know the next time I'm in Alice Springs when your son is driving, please?
Well, he's in Melbourne now, so it's your problem, not mine.
Okay, let's move on. I'd like to thank Beth Barber and Melbourne Climate Futures for organising and hosting this panel discussion. I'd like to thank the online audience and the in-person audience here for being engaged so much. And in particular, I'd like to thank Rowan Foley, Kate Dooley, and Malte Munchausen for being involved as the panel discussants. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Well done. Thanks, Beth.
We will be making available, first of all, the questions that came in, as well as the panel presentations that were given at the beginning to all the discussants. We won't be asking each of the panel members to answer all of the questions because they grew like Topsy over time. Thank you very much.